Evolution cannot account for rationality, because evolution says we are programmed in the world to survive and reproduce. Our minds are organs of survival. They are not organs of truth. So if we believe in rationality, we require something outside of evolution to account for that. Evolution can't even account for morality. Now, this requires a little bit of explanation. So think of a couple of moral facts. And I'm not talking about heroic deeds of greatness. Think of simple things. Getting up to give your seat to an old lady in a bus. Donating blood. There's a famine in Haiti, you volunteer your time or you write a check. Now, if we are evolved primates who are programmed to survive and reproduce, why would we do these things? There's a whole literature on this, and basically it comes down to this. The advocates of evolution say, well, evolution is a form of extended selfishness. If a mother jumps into a burning car to save her 2 children, that's because she and her children have the same genes. So what seems like an altruistic and noble deed is actually merely a cunning strategy on the part of the mom to make sure her genes make it into the next generation. We're not talking about her Levi's. We're talking about her genetic inheritance. Or evolution appeals to what can be called reciprocal advantage. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. A businessman may be nice to a customer, not because he thinks he's a great guy, but because he wants him to come back into the store again. But these two common evolutionary strategies to explain morality don't explain the 3 examples I gave at all. I'm in a bus, the old lady hobbles in. She's not a relative, she isn't grandma. So genetic kinship doesn't come into it, and neither does reciprocal advantage. I don't say, well, I think I'll give her my seat because next week I want her seat. No, you give up your seat because you're a nice guy. You give up blood because you want to do a good thing. You donate your time to help strangers who are genetically unrelated to you and can't reciprocate your favors. These are the simple facts of morality in the world. And what is the evolutionary explanation for them? There is none, or if there is one, I would like to hear it. So in debating these issues, very often it's very easy to knock the burden of proof onto the theist and say, you explain everything. But no, in the world we're not in the position where there's only one explanation contending. There are rival explanations. There is a theist explanation, the God explanation, and there is a non-theist or atheist explanation. We have to weigh the two against each other. My contention is that the atheist explanation flounders when confronted with all these facts: the complexity of the cell, the fine-tuning of the universe, the fact of morality, the depth of human evil, the reality of morality in the world. What about the God explanation? Seems obvious to me. It does one heck of a lot better. Why do we have a cell that shows the structure of complexity? Because the cell has been intelligently designed, perhaps by an intelligent designer. Why does the universe show complexity and rationality? Well, those are the characteristics of the Creator who made it that way. Why are there depths of human evil? Because our lives are a cosmic drama in which good and evil are in constant struggle. The Christian story. Why is there morality in the world? Why do we all feel, even when it works against our advantage, a moral law within us? Well, that's because there is a moral lawgiver who gave it to us. So when we put it all together, the presupposition of God is invisible. I concede that. We can't see him. But if we posit him, all these mysterious facts, suddenly the lights come on. It provides an explanation. Now again, with any presuppositional argument, there may be a better alternative explanation. And so I put the ball into Christopher Hitchens' court to say, if you can explain these facts better than I can, I will happily, as a skeptic, concede to your point of view. Give me a better explanation for these facts. I leave you with this thought. Ultimately, we know that belief is good for us. If it was a primitive explanation of 3,000 years ago, why would it be the case that religion hasn't disappeared 3,000 years ago? Why is it the case that we're actually seeing religious revivals around the world? Why is the fact of religious experience? It's almost as if you go to a village and 95% of those people in the village say, we know this guy named Bill. Why? Because we interact with him, we relate to him, we have experience of him. 5 guys say, we've never met Bill. And 3 of them say there is no Bill. The other 95% are making him up. Now, which is more likely? Is it likely that the 3% are right and the 95% are lying or hallucinating? Or is it more likely that the 95% are right and the other 3% just don't know the guy? When you look at the fact of religious experience in the world today, to simply write it off as a primitive explanation of why ancient man couldn't explain the thunder seems idiotically unrelated to the fact that religion serves current needs and current wants. So religion is not the problem. God is not the problem. God is, in fact, the answer to the problem. Thank you.
I never hear Dinesh doing that without thinking what a wonderful Muslim he would make. You try telling 100 people in Saudi Arabia that you don't think the Prophet Muhammad really heard those voices. You're going to be really outvoted. And yes, Dinesh, I have noticed there are religious revivals going on. I pay a lot of attention to them. I don't find them as welcome, perhaps, as you do. And on your detective hypothesis, don't you think there's something to be said for considering unfalsifiability when constructing a hypothesis? For example, Albert Einstein staked his reputation. He said, if I'm wrong about this, then there will not be an eclipse at a certain time of day and month and year off the west coast of Africa, and I will look a fool. But if I'm right, there will be one. And people foregathered thinking he can't be that smart, and he was. Professor J.B.S. Haldane used to be asked, well, what would shake your faith in evolution? This was when it was much more controversial than it is now, and I'm impressed to find that Dinesh believes in intelligent design, which really does require, I would think, a leap of faith, but there it is. Haldane said, well, show me rabbits' bones in the Jurassic layer, and I'll give up. Now, can you think of any religious spokesman you've ever heard who would tell you in advance what would disprove their hypothesis? Of course you can't, because it's unfalsifiable. And we were all taught, weren't we, by Professor Karl Popper, that unfalsifiability in a theory is a test not of its strength, but of its weakness. So you can't beat it. The church used to say, no, God didn't allow evolution. Indeed, instead, he hid the bones in the rocks to test our faith. That didn't work out too well. So now they say, now we know about it. It proves how incredibly clever he was all along. It's an infinitely elastic airbag. And there's no argument that I can bring or anyone else can bring against it, and that's what should make you suspicious. Then a question for Dinesh. I know I'm supposed to be answering them as well as asking them, but it does intrigue me when I debate with religious people. He announced, I have his words, he was going to talk without reference to revelation, scripture, or scriptural authority. Now, why, ask yourselves then, I'll ask you, why is that? Why do I never come up against someone who says, I'll tell you why I'm religious? Because I think that Jesus of Nazareth is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except by him. And if you will believe on this, you will be given eternal life. I'd be impressed if people would sometimes say that. Why do the religious people so often feel they must say, no, we don't, well, that's all sort of metaphorical? In what sense are they then religious? You'll notice that Dinesh talked about the operations of the divine and the Creator only in the observable natural order. That's what used to be called the deist position. It was the position held by skeptics like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson by the end of the 18th century. It was as far as anyone could see before Darwin and before Einstein. There appeared to be evidence of design in the universe, but there was no evidence of divine intervention in it. Very important point. The deist may say, and I would have to say, it cannot be disproved that there was a first cause and that it was godly. That cannot be disproved. It can only be argued that there's no evidence for it. But the deists, having established that position, if they have, has all their work still ahead of them to show that there is a God who cares about us, even knows we exist, takes sides in our little tribal wars, cares who we sleep with and in what position, cares what we eat and on what day of the week, arbitrates matters of this kind. That's the conceited, that's the endless human wish to believe that we have parents who want to look out for us and help us not to grow up or get out of the way. And so it surprises me that there are no professions of real religious faith ever made on these occasions. Now, I suppose I should then say what my own method in this is, since I was challenged on that point. Take the two figures of Jesus of Nazareth and Socrates. I believe Jesus of Nazareth operates on the fringe of mythology and prehistory. I don't think it's absolutely certainly established there was such a person, or that he made those pronouncements, or that he was the Son of God, or the son of a virgin, or any of these things. And I would likewise have to concede that we only know of the work of Socrates through second-hand sources, in the same way, second or third-hand. Quite impressive ones in some cases, from Plato's Apology, but it can't be demonstrated to me that Socrates ever walked the streets of Athens.
That's 5 minutes.
How many?
That's 5 minutes.
That's fine. Just quickly, though. If it could be shown to a believing Christian, the grave of Jesus opened and the body of him found and the resurrection disproved, if that could be archaeologically done for the sake of argument, it would presumably be a disaster for you. You'd have to think, then we're alone. Then how are we going to know right from wrong? What can we do? I maintain with Socrates that, on the contrary, the moral problems and ethical problems and other dilemmas that we have would be exactly the same as they are. What are our duties to each other? How could we build the just city? How should we think? How can we face the possibility of our loneliness? How can we do right? These questions would remain exactly as they are, and as they do. And so all that is necessary is to transcend the superstitious, transcend the mythical, and accept the responsibility, take it on ourselves, that no one can do this for us. And I would hope that in a great university, that thought might carry the day. Thank you.
Somewhat like the mosquito in the nudist colony, I'm trying to decide where to begin. I might begin by noting that in my opening statement, I offered kind of a challenge to Christopher Hitchens. I mentioned anomalous features of the world as it is and of the evolutionary explanation, and offered to him the chance to offer rival theories that might do better than the God explanation. I just want to note that he has offered none. Instead, what he has offered is the idea that science is based on verifiability, but religion not. This, I think, is in fact not true. And he said no one's ever given him an example of it, and I'm about to give him two. The ancient Hebrews asserted, uniquely, by the way, of all religions, that God made the universe out of nothing. Now, incidentally, the idea that God or gods made the universe is a very old idea. But in every other religion, God or gods fashioned the universe out of some other stuff. God is a kind of carpenter. He took the stuff of the universe and he made life and he made man. But the Hebrews said no, there was nothing, and then there was a universe. And I want to suggest that modern science has proved this to be 100% correct. If you go to an introductory physics class at Notre Dame, you will learn that as a direct consequence of the Big Bang, not only did the universe have a beginning, not only did all the matter have a beginning, but space and time also had a beginning. In other words, first there was nothing, no space, no time. And then there was a universe with space and time. Suddenly the Christian concept of eternity, of a God being outside of space and time, which for centuries was scientifically unintelligible, is now not only coherent, but riding alongside the most cutting-edge discoveries in modern physics and modern astronomy. The ancient Hebrews and the Old Testament predicts that the people of Israel, after being dispersed, would return. There would be, if you will, a reuniting of the state of Israel. Until the 1940s, this was a possibility historically so preposterous that if someone had actually suggested it, they would meet with derisive laughter. And yet, it has in fact happened. just as the Bible said it would. Now, these are not scientific theories. If you talk to the ancient Hebrews and say, how do you know that there was nothing and there was a universe? They didn't do any scientific experiments. They basically said, God told me. But I'm saying that if you look at that as a prophecy or as a factual claim about the world, we now know 2,000 years later that it is in its essence correct. The reason that I can't go on like this is because religion addresses different types of questions than scientific questions. Here are three. Here we are flung into the world. One question we have is, what's the purpose of our life? Or, why are we here? Or, where are we going? What happens to us after we die? Here are the scientific answers to those three questions. Don't have a clue, don't have a clue, and don't have a clue. We are no closer to answering those questions scientifically than we were since the time of the Babylonians. So what is wrong in looking to religion to supply explanations in a domain where science is utterly inert, inarticulate, and in fact mute? You can't just say that if you understand the ballistics of plate tectonics, you understand purpose. It would be as if my dad took me on his knee and gave me a spanking, and Christopher Hitchens goes, don't think he's angry with you. If you only understood the ballistics of the cane, you would have a full explanation of what's going on. Or on the other hand, if I put a pot of tea on the kettle and began to boil it, Hitchens can't say, well, if I tell you about if you say, what's going on here? Well, the scientific explanation is that water, when heated, the molecules expand, the temperature rises. But there's another explanation. Dinesh wants to have a cup of tea. So explanations work at more than one level. And finally, Christopher asks, why argue this way? Well, we know about presenting the case the other way. In fact, you get it in church, or you get it in synagogue, or you get it every Sunday. The argument from the Bible, the argument from authority. I know it's a useless argument to use in a secular setting, especially when debating with an atheist. If I say, I believe in Jesus because the book of Matthew says this, or the Gospel of Luke says that, he's going to say, well, who cares what the Gospel of Luke says? I don't accept the authority of the Bible to adjudicate the matter. So we are at a state in our culture in which we have to use rational arguments if we are trying to communicate in secular venues. So here we are at a university. What could be more appropriate than to address these arguments in the vocabulary of reason? Christopher wants me to fling the Bible at him so he can then claim the high ground of science and reason. What flummoxes him is when I use science and reason itself to torpedo his arguments. That's when you get him going down on his knees and praying for some more quotations from Scripture. Thank you very much.
We now have time for questions. We have 2 microphones down in front. If you have a question for either of our speakers, please come forward and line up. It has been suggested that I start the question period with a question for each of our 2 speakers. That's an opportunity I gladly accept. After I'm done asking questions, I'll field questions from the audience. Please, you're free to indicate to whom your question is directed, but we'll give both speakers the opportunity to weigh in. Please limit yourself to 1 brief question. I'm the only one that gets 2. If your question runs long, I will interrupt and ask you to focus it. If it continues to run long, I will ask you to sit down. If it continues to run long, you don't want that to happen. There will be no follow-up questioning. Once you've asked your question, please step aside from the mic, and those are the ground rules. So now I'll start with questions. As I understand it, the basic argument that Christopher Hitchens is giving, I haven't seen the text, but as I understand it, the argument can be summed up roughly like this. Religion gives explanations, science gives better explanations. Our job is to go with the best explanations. So we ought to go in for science all the time and set religion aside as superstition. D'Souza wants to address this on Hitchens' turf. So I'm going to start by asking a question of D'Souza. It looked like your goal was to show that theistic explanations are in fact better than scientific explanations. As I saw it, what you in fact said showed that scientific explanations are often problematic, incomplete, and gappy, but I don't think you showed that theistic explanations are better. And just to pick a couple of examples, so for example, you talk about the fine-tuning argument. So here's a case where maybe belief in God explains certain features of the universe better than atheistic theories would. But of course, one wonders if the world is superintended by a perfectly good God, whence the Holocaust, right? Whence all manner of horrendous evil and suffering. And so all of a sudden it looks like the appeal to God to explain features of the universe, it's not clear that theism's winning. Take morality too, right? On the one hand, sure, we maybe can understand where moral laws come from if there's a divine lawgiver. On the other hand, Christianity has a doctrine of original sin. Christianity has other things that confound our moral intuitions, right? So again, it's not clear that theism wins.
Well, that's a lot to chew on. Look, the standards that I'm appealing to are, in a way, very intuitive. We have currently a major scientific project to look for life on other planets. Now, truth of it is, if we were to get information that on, let's say, the moon Europa, we found hieroglyphics, some interesting architectural structures, some apparent roving vehicles, this would settle the argument. Right away, we would conclude, as long as we didn't put them there, that there must be some other forms of life that have done that. If someone came along and said molecules of sand assembled themselves into all this, this would be an explanation, but a stupid one compared to the inference to intelligent design. So, in fact, the scientists say that even if we get radio signals in Morse code, they would be adequate to demonstrate the existence of intelligent life elsewhere. So my point is, let's apply the reasonable standard. If we see a fine-tuned universe, what's more likely? Someone fine-tuned it, or it fine-tuned itself? Could the universe have created itself out of nothing? Is there some alternative explanation for the data at hand? No. So I'm simply saying, let's go with the best explanation. By the way, my argument isn't eternal. If 20 years from now you had a scientific argument that was better, that said, hey, we figured it all out, I would go with that. I would have to drop this argument. I'm saying that in the current mode of knowledge and thinking, this is a successful explanation. You can't change the subject and say, well, now explain the Holocaust. That requires a different set of rebuttals. I would say the Holocaust is the product of free will. God didn't do the Holocaust, Hitler did. The Nazis did. To try to deflect blame to God for human action voluntarily undertaken is to minimize the human capacity for evil. But whether or not that argument works, it has nothing to do with the design argument. And finally, morality, very briefly. Again, if evolution could adequately account for morality, let's remember that the atheist premise is that we are evolved creatures in the world, and that's it. So evolution has to do a lot of work. It has to explain the human desire to give blood to strangers. If it can't do that, then it fails as an adequate explanation for a very important form of human behavior, morality, that is seen in every culture known to man. It requires explanation. I have an alternative explanation, that in human beings there are two parts. We are evolutionary creatures in the world. That explains why we desire sex and we desire food to survive, to reproduce. But then I have this other thing inside of me, what Adam Smith calls the impartial spectator. And that's another voice. And it's in me, but it's not of me. In fact, it's often stopping me from doing what I want to do. It's blocking my self-interest. Where does that come from? How does evolution account for that? So I'm saying that the God hypothesis casts more light on that subject, the hypothesis of a moral lawgiver. In fact, even the hypothesis of a life to come. You may say a final court in which our moral deeds will be adjudicated. Explains why we act the way we do now. Otherwise, our own behavior is incomprehensible to us. That's the strength of the presuppositional argument.
Do you want to comment on this, or just take my question for you?
I think both. I'll stand up for your question, and I'll see if I can do both. But I know people are impatient to get to the next segment. Bring it on.
My question for you is very quick. Your argument seems to rest on the idea that religion is an explanatory enterprise, and that the warrant for believing the doctrines of a particular religion comes from their explanatory value. Why would you think that?
Well, because of religion's own very large claims. And because, it's something I didn't have time to go into, because not all these religions can be simultaneously true. I mean, there are enormous numbers of competing religions. It's another reason that it's obvious to me that they're man-made. It's what you would expect if it was man-made, that there'd be lots of religions with incompatible claims and theologies, and that this would lead to further quarreling. Either one of them is completely true, as the Roman Church used to say, it was the one true church. Some of its members still do. Or all of them are false, or all of them are true, which of course can't be true. Now to Dinesh, and the matter of anomalies and the question of ex nihilo. Half the time when I debate, it's people saying, nothing can come from nothing, you can't get something from nothing, so since there is something, someone must have wanted there to be something. Not, I think, a very impressive syllogism. I can't do it all this evening, but it's very easy for anyone to go and see Professor Lawrence Krauss deliver his brilliant lecture online called A Whole Universe from Nothing, which explains to you how indeed you can get very large numbers of things from nothing with the proper understanding of quantum theory. And then tonight Dinesh says, really there was nothing, and the Hebrews were so clever that they knew that. And therefore they must have been right about God as well. This is ridiculous. The ancient Hebrews also thought that God made man and women out of nothing or out of dust and clay, whereas we have an exact knowledge, or increasingly exact knowledge, of precisely the genetic materials in common with other creatures from which we were assembled. And then, not content with that, he says biblical prophecy is true in respect of Palestine. This is an extraordinary thing, and you were right to mention the Holocaust. If it's true that God wanted the Jews to get back to Palestine, then it must have been true that he wanted their exile to be ended, the galut, as it's known to Zionism, the exile, the wandering. And we know how that wandering was ended, by Christian Europe throwing living Jewish babies into furnaces. Well, that must be part of the plan then, mustn't it? And some rabbis used to claim that, by the way. They used to claim that the Holocaust was a punishment for exile. And then people started to desert the synagogue, so they shut up about it until the '67 war. And then when the Israeli army got the Wailing Wall back, they said, we shouldn't have spoken so quickly. Actually, this was what God always had in mind all along, the conquest by Jews of the Palestinians, where you see how brilliantly that's worked out. I don't think it's wise or moral or decent to try and detect the finger of God in human quarrels. I think the enterprise is futile, and it incidentally shows the absurdity of all arguments from design. Thank you.
Thank you both for coming tonight. I'm wondering if either or both of you can acknowledge, or rather I'd like to hear your feelings on the possibility of your thoughts and your theories on religion or lack of a God being simply a product of your environment. Or to phrase another way, if you were born to a different family in a different place, perhaps with a different skin color, Christopher, would you still be an atheist? And Dinesh, would you still be, I'm assuming, Christian, a believer in religion? Or could the roles be completely reversed? And are your theories and your thoughts strictly based on your upbringing?
Well, was it to me first? Well, in that case, I can start with a compliment to Dinesh, because in one of his books, he tells the story of asking his father in India, Daddy, everyone around here seems to be Hindu, with quite a few Muslims. Why are we Christians? And his father said, because, Dinesh, my lad, the Portuguese Inquisition got to this part of India first. Which is, in fact, the full and complete explanation for that.
Actually,
so you can tell Dinesh was very well brought up in this respect, and he's made the most of it. Obviously, in my case, this does not apply because, obviously, if you ask someone in Buffalo, why did you go to the Roman Catholic Church, he'll say, because my parents were from Poznan. It's the overwhelmingly probable explanation. Why did you go to a Greek Orthodox church? My parents were born in Thessaloniki. Of course, this is true, but there are a lot of people who convert. In fact, quite a large number of Muslims on their way out of Islam embrace Christianity, which is a very risky thing to do. It must be something they care a lot about, and I think one should take seriously. And though it was relatively easy for me, being born in England and emigrating to America, to leave the Church of England behind, that, believe me, is no sweat. Our great religious poet, our great Christian poet, George Herbert, refers to the sweet mediocrity of our native church. What do you get if you cross an Anglican with the Jehovah's Witness? Someone who comes to your door and bothers you for no particular reason. So, enough from me.
Well, I think we have an environmental explanation for Christopher's skepticism. He was raised in a religion that was based on the family values of Henry VIII. Enough said. Now, with regard to the Indian explanation, his explanation is true but incomplete. And here's the point. My grandfather did say that to me, and I began to read Indian history. And I realized that a handful of Portuguese missionaries, inquisitorial or not, would have a pretty hard time converting hundreds of thousands of people. And Indian historians who look at it have a better explanation. It's called the caste system. See, if you were born into the Hindu caste system and you were one of the guys on the lower rungs of the ladder, to put it somewhat bluntly, you were screwed. It didn't matter what merit you had, you couldn't rise up, and neither could your children. So along come these greedy missionaries, and maybe they had swords, but the truth of it is a lot of Indians were very eager to get out of the caste system. They didn't need the swords. They rushed into the arms of the missionaries because they promised something that the Hindus couldn't, universal brotherhood. It wasn't always practiced, but even the idea of it, the principle of it, was hugely appealing. And that's why there were mass conversions not only to Christianity, but also to Islam, which makes a similar promise. So this is the historical landscape. A final point about this is that we're committing here what could be called a genetic fallacy. We do it with religion. We always can see the fallacy if we apply it to any other area. For example, it is very probable that there are more people who believe in Darwin's theory of evolution who come from Oxford, England, than who come from Oxford, Mississippi. It's probably equally true that there are more people who believe in Einstein's theory of relativity who come from New York than who come from New Guinea. What does this say about whether Einstein's theory is correct or no? Nothing. The origins of your ideas have no bearing on whether they're true or not. So wherever Christopher and I got our ideologies or our religious convictions, you should weigh our arguments on the merits. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Mr. D'Souza, you mentioned that you would only speak basically in secular terms, in terms of defending your faith without appealing to revelation or anything of that sort. Do you feel that there is an advantage for the world population at large for religious people to be required to defend their faith in such a venue, or do you feel that we would be better off if you had the luxury of only defending your faith within congregations of the faithful and without counterpart skeptics to demand that sort of intellectual line?
I've argued that I think that Christians need to learn to be bilingual. And by that I mean to speak perhaps two languages, a Christian language at home or in church, and a more secular language in the public square. Not because we want to wear two faces, but because we want to make our arguments accessible to people who may not share our assumptions. And so a lot of times, if someone says, what do you think about gay marriage? The Christian opens to the book of Leviticus, not recognizing that the person he's talking to does not recognize the authority of Leviticus to decide the matter. So it becomes a futile enterprise, two ships in the night. The only way to have debate is to meet on some common ground. And in that sense, I think in a democratic society, the common ground of reason is a perfectly appropriate language for democratic discourse. So what we're doing here is a secular intellectual enterprise. If I was speaking, as I sometimes do, in a megachurch or at a Catholic event, I might speak in a little different language, but that's because I'm speaking to an audience with different assumptions.
My name's Ian.
No, it was for Dinesh.
I'm Ian from the Michiana Skeptics. My question is for Dinesh. Christopher, you kind of addressed this already. It's on the issue of spontaneous generation. Dinesh, you used the analogy with the jet being spontaneously put together by a thunderstorm, in a junkyards of sorts. I was wondering, how do you defend the argument that it's more likely that a creator did this when, even though it's unlikely that, say, something would have randomly created a cell or a molecule over time, there's still, in the infinite spans of things, in the vast amount of time that the universe has existed, some minuscule probability that this could have come about, versus this blatant argument that it must have been this because it's improbable when there is no really backing for the reverse argument. How do you counteract this? And also, if you have anything to add to this, Christopher.
It is true that one can always, by re-rigging the assumptions, create new probabilities. So, for example, there are many physicists who have computed that if you look at all the particles of matter in the entire universe, the chance of them randomly assembling to produce a cell is essentially zero. However, you can increase that probability by adding universes. And there are many cosmologists who say, well, what if there are 1,000 universes or an infinity of universes? Then, in the infinity of time, and that's a problematic statement in itself, but with an infinity of universes, an infinity of transactions, even improbable events do occur. The problem with that is you can call it not only a scandalous violation of Occam's razor, it's essentially syllogistic promiscuity. Because what is the evidence that there is even one other universe other than our own? Empirically, none. You're essentially making up universes to account for the anomalies of the universe we have. So, which is more likely? It's almost as if the atheist, to try to abolish one invisible God, has to fabricate an infinity of invisible universes. I mean, I'd like to believe that, but frankly, I don't have that much faith.
The person violating the principle of William of Ockham here, I think, though, Dinesh, is you. I mean, everyone remembers what Laplace said to Napoleon when he produced he was the greatest scientist of his day, his orrery, the solar system as viewed from the outside, never been done before in model form. And the emperor said, well, there doesn't seem to be any God in this apparatus. And Laplace said, well, Your Majesty, it happens to operate perfectly well without that assumption. So it does. Dinesh asked earlier, and I should have taken him up on it, isn't it the case that to the three questions, where are we coming, where are we from, where are we going, and why are we here, there are three nopes from our side. That's not true at all. It was incredible that he alleged it. So the question of where are we from, both in the macro and the micro term, where did we come from, the cosmological, the Big Bang, and the micro, the unraveling of the human string of DNA and our kinship with other animals and indeed other forms of non-animal life, we are enormously to enormously greater extent well informed about our origins. And what we don't know, we don't claim to know. Very important. My admitting that I don't know exactly how it began is not at all the same as Dinesh's admission that he doesn't know either, because he feels he has to know. Because if it's not a matter of faith and it's not a matter of God, he can't say he believes in it a little bit. It must be a real belief to be genuine, and it must have some explanatory value. And he doesn't hold it very strongly, and it doesn't explain anything for which we have better explanations. Likewise about where we are going. We have a very good idea now of the time and place